The emptiness in an empath's eyes is one of the most disturbing symptoms, as a person who was once compassionate and open begins to withdraw. This gaze seems distant, tired, and indifferent, yet simultaneously conceals a profound process of inner transformation. In Carl Jung's psychology, such a shift is often linked to defense mechanisms that develop when an individual experiences chronic emotional stress or emotional overload. Empaths, by nature, have the ability to deeply feel the emotions of others. They often become a vessel, absorbing all the feelings, sorrows, and joys of those around them. This type of sensitivity can lead to emotional overload, especially when appropriate boundaries are lacking. The more emotions an empath absorbs, the greater the need to protect themselves from this influx. Eventually, when their inner energy is completely depleted, they begin to emotionally shut down to protect themselves from further depletion. When an empath begins to withdraw, their emotions become less accessible, both to themselves and to others. This lack of emotional engagement leads to distance in relationships. A person who was once understanding and supportive now becomes distant, silent, and withdrawn. This is a defense mechanism, an attempt to protect themselves from emotional burnout. This withdrawal can create a sense of rejection in others who previously felt supported by this person. Modern interpersonal relationships, especially in the context of empathy, are often burdened by emotional mismanagement. Empaths, as individuals who shoulder too much emotional burden, don't always understand the importance of setting boundaries. When these boundaries aren't clearly defined, it's easy to fall into exhaustion. Jungian psychology speaks of shadows, parts of our psyche that are ignored or suppressed, and which, ultimately, reveal themselves in the most destructive ways. The emptiness in an empath's eyes isn't just an internal emptiness, but also a signal to others. It indicates that the person is already, in a different space, emotionally cut off from their surrounding relationships. This change in behavior can have serious consequences. Relationships become superficial, communication becomes increasingly difficult, and trust is undermined. Those around the empath may begin to feel that their emotional needs are no longer being recognized, leading to feelings of alienation. Although an empath may appear indifferent at such a moment, it's actually just a way of coping with mounting stress and emotional overload. Their eyes no longer reflect the same openness they once had, but that doesn't mean they don't feel emotions. On the contrary, it's evidence of how strongly others' emotions affect them. This withdrawal is their way of surviving in a world that has become too intense and overwhelming. However, from a Jungian perspective, this process of withdrawal is not permanent. It is merely a stage that can lead to self-transformation if the empath takes action to regain balance. Appropriate techniques, such as introspection, recognizing one's shadows, and understanding defense mechanisms, can help empaths regain their lost connection with their emotions, and thus with others. It's important to understand, then, that the emptiness in an empath's eyes is a signal that shouldn't be ignored. It's a call for deeper reflection on how we manage our emotions, what boundaries we set with others, and how we maintain our emotional balance to avoid exhaustion. Empathy, while inherently a gift, can also become a source of immense suffering if not managed properly. For empathetic individuals, who are capable of feeling the emotions of others with an intensity often exceeding their own experience, being in an environment rife with negative emotions becomes not only a challenge but also a serious threat to their mental and physical health. When an empath begins to absorb the emotions of those around them excessively, without the appropriate protective tools, emotional exhaustion becomes inevitable. In Jungian psychology, emotional overload and its consequences for the individual psyche are understood as a serious disruption of internal balance. Jung observed that if we are unable to recognize when our emotional boundaries have been crossed, our psyche begins to employ a variety of defense mechanisms. In the case of empaths, who are by definition more open to external emotional impulses, this process can occur almost imperceptibly. Emotional overinvolvement leads to exhaustion, a state in which the empath feels literally drained of energy. Such individuals, who are normally ubiquitous listeners, advisors, and comforters, begin to experience moments when they feel empty, unable to receive or give anything. Their emotions become empty, and instead of strengthening connections with others, they begin to withdraw to avoid further burden. Initially, emotional exhaustion may manifest itself in subtle signs: a decreased desire for social interaction, a lack of energy, or a loss of interest in previously important matters. However, over time, as there is no space for regeneration, the symptoms become increasingly apparent: difficulty maintaining close relationships, avoidance of situations that could again make the empath feel overwhelmed, and, as mentioned, a characteristic emptiness in the eyes. From a Jungian perspective, these mechanisms of withdrawal and exhaustion are the result of a lack of integration of the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, is the part of the psyche we choose not to acknowledge, our hidden fears, desires, and the negative emotions we try to suppress. For an empath, who lives in constant interaction with the feelings of others, ignoring one's own boundaries can lead to a distortion of this process. The lack of space to process one's own emotions makes the empath unable to distinguish between their own feelings and those they perceive from the outside. Without time for reflection and rest, psychological burnout eventually occurs. Furthermore, over-involvement in the emotions of others can lead to a distortion of the very concept of empathy. Empathy shouldn't mean constantly absorbing another's emotions, but rather the ability to understand them and respond appropriately. When an empath immerses themselves in the emotions of others, losing the ability to separate their own feelings from those of others, they cease to be helpful not only to themselves but also to others. Instead of providing support, they become, in a sense, an emotional prisoner, locked in a cycle of constantly absorbing the pain, joy, and fear of others. This state of emotional exhaustion, however, is not irreversible. According to Jungian theory, for an empath to regain balance, it is essential to recognize and integrate their own shadows, accepting that they cannot continually sacrifice themselves for others at the expense of themselves. The process of individuation, or becoming their full self, is key to healing and restoring emotional balance. An empath must learn to protect themselves from the excessive influence of others' emotions while simultaneously preserving their capacity for empathy and compassion. To prevent exhaustion, empaths should also work on establishing healthy emotional boundaries. Only when they have the space to regenerate can they effectively share their empathy without losing their inner balance. In Carl Jung's psychology, defense mechanisms play a key role in explaining why empaths who become emotionally involved in the lives of others for long periods of time may begin to withdraw and lose their capacity for deep empathy. Jung observed that our psyche employs a variety of defense mechanisms to protect us from excessive emotional stress. These mechanisms are our natural way of trying to maintain psychological balance in the face of external and internal threats. One of the key defense mechanisms that impact empaths is repression. This is a process in which we unconsciously suppress unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or memories to avoid confronting them. For empaths who experience the strong emotions of others daily, suppressing their own feelings becomes an easy defense mechanism. To survive emotionally challenging situations, empaths begin to ignore their own emotional needs, focusing solely on the emotions of others. However, long-term repression leads to self-alienation, which in turn makes it increasingly difficult to maintain authentic, meaningful connections with others. Another defense mechanism that can lead an empath to withdraw is projection. Projection involves attributing one's own unacceptable traits, emotions, or fears to others. Empaths who are unable to cope with the intensity of their own feelings may begin to perceive others as more negative, critical, or distant. This creates distance, even if they were initially a source of support for these same individuals. Projection can also lead to the illusion that others do not need empathy, causing the empath to increasingly close themselves off from external emotions, protecting themselves from further burden. Denial is another defense mechanism that can occur in empaths. Denial involves denying the existence of a problem, despite its presence. Empaths may begin to ignore their own emotional needs, downplaying symptoms of burnout, convinced they can hold on a little longer, or others need them more. This attitude not only leads to further exhaustion but also to increased frustration and a sense of helplessness. Empaths who deny their emotional changes may fall into the belief that their own feelings are unimportant, ultimately leading to a complete disconnection from themselves. Jungian psychology also points to the mechanism of isolation, which can be a natural response for empaths to the stressful impact of other emotions. Isolation means creating a barrier between oneself and the outside world to protect oneself from excessive emotional burden. For empaths who experience deep sensitivity to the emotions of others, isolation can be a means of survival, especially during difficult times. However, like other defense mechanisms, isolation is not a long-term solution, as it leads to a deepening sense of loneliness and a loss of authenticity in relationships. All of these defense mechanisms, while intended to protect the individual from emotional overload, can paradoxically contribute to the empath's deepening withdrawal. Instead of finding a balance between engagement and protecting their own boundaries, the empath begins to employ increasingly stronger emotional barriers that prevent authentic connection with others. From a Jungian perspective, the solution to this problem lies in the process of individuation, or development toward self-fullness. Individuation is a path to understanding and integrating all parts of our psyche, including those that have been suppressed or ignored. Empaths who undergo the individuation process begin to understand their emotional needs, establish healthy boundaries, and accept their own shadows. Only then can they truly rebuild their capacity for empathy without abandoning themselves in the process. Jungian psychology also offers tools that can help empaths regain their balance. Through awareness work, introspection, and recognizing defense mechanisms, empaths can begin to rebuild their relationships without losing their inner strength and energy. In interpersonal relationships, silence often speaks louder than words. When an empath, naturally sensitive and eager to help, begins to withdraw, this silence becomes one of the most powerful signals that something is changing in the relationship. From a Jungian perspective, emotional disengagement is not simply the result of a mood shift, but a deeper defense mechanism that operates in response to emotional overload. In this context, silence becomes a space where communication and mutual understanding begin to fade. Silence in relationships is often the result of an empath losing emotional engagement in conversations and interactions. Instead of actively participating, listening, and responding, they begin to withdraw into silence, which can be interpreted by others as indifference or a burden. This emotional absence becomes a barrier, resulting in a lack of deeper connection and understanding. What was once full and dynamic now becomes cold and distant. For an empath who absorbs the emotions of others for a long time, this engagement may stem from a need to protect their own emotional resources. Over time, the constant drawing in of others' emotions leads to exhaustion. Hence, in order to protect themselves, the empath stops responding to emotional impulses and begins to avoid intense interactions. This silence is a way to gain space for regeneration, but in the context of interpersonal relationships, it has its consequences. From a Jungian perspective, the defense mechanism that leads to silence is primarily a form of psychological isolation. When an empath feels emotionally overloaded, they begin to erect mental barriers that allow them to minimize the impact of external emotions. At the same time, this isolation, while protecting against exhaustion, leads to a decline in the quality of communication. An empath who stops responding emotionally begins to distance themselves from others, and their interactions become superficial and based solely on superficial information. This lack of emotional engagement has profound consequences for the quality of relationships. Communication that was once filled with understanding now begins to lose its depth. What once might have been a space for sharing experiences, emotions, and reflections now becomes a conversation about trivial matters, irrelevant topics that miss the point. An empath who withdraws doesn't want others to feel overwhelmed by their emotional state, so they try to minimize their feelings and express themselves in a neutral manner. From a psychological perspective, this lack of emotional engagement leads to barriers to trust and intimacy. Relationships once based on deep understanding and support begin to lose their strength, as silence no longer represents simply a lack of words but also a lack of understanding. An empath who withdraws doesn't want to burden others, but in reality, this silence can be interpreted as rejection or indifference. Silence in relationships, however, is not irreversible. From a Jungian perspective, the process of individuation allows for a renewed understanding of oneself and one's emotional boundaries, which can lead to a rebuilding of commitment in relationships. In this process, an empath must learn to combine their sensitivity with the need to protect their emotional resources. This also involves the ability to establish healthy boundaries and restore authenticity in relationships without sacrificing oneself. To overcome silence in relationships, an empath must begin by recognizing their emotions and then expressing them in a way that doesn't lead to exhaustion. This requires openness to ourselves and others, as well as a willingness to change the way we respond to emotions. This process is lengthy, but it can be achieved through consciously managing our emotional boundaries and working on integrating our shadow, as Jung recommends. Empathy, while a great gift, can lead to exhaustion if not managed properly. When an empath begins to feel overwhelmed by the emotions of others and their ability to deeply engage in relationships begins to fade, the need for inner healing arises. In his Psychology, Carl Jung offers a range of tools that can help empaths restore emotional balance and regain the ability to authentically connect with others without losing themselves in the process. One of the key tools in Jungian psychology is individuation, a process in which an individual strives to integrate all aspects of their psyche, both conscious and unconscious. For an empath, individuation means the ability to recognize their emotional needs, acknowledge their sensitivity, and learn to set healthy boundaries. Jung emphasizes that only when we fully accept ourselves, including our dark sides, can we regain balance and true emotional strength. Individuation is a path that allows an empath to discover their true identity, independent of external influences. For empaths who have long absorbed the emotions of others, this process is especially important, as it allows them to regain a sense of authenticity. By recognizing and integrating their shadows, those parts of their psyche that have been rejected or repressed, empaths can begin to feel more whole, allowing them to better manage their emotions in relationships. Another key Jungian tool is shadow work, which plays a crucial role in the healing of empaths. The shadow represents those aspects of our personality that are ignored or rejected, often containing untapped reserves of strength and energy. For empaths who feel a strong need to help others, shadow work means examining their own limitations, fears, and unmet needs. Through this process, empaths can understand that they don't have to sacrifice themselves for others at the expense of themselves, but can instead draw on their own inner resources to be more aware and present in relationships. From a Jungian perspective, a crucial element of empath healing is the recognition and integration of archetypes, which are universal patterns of behavior and attitudes present in every psyche. Archetypes such as the mother, warrior, and sage can help empaths develop and discover their inner resources. For example, the warrior archetype can help empaths learn to set boundaries and defend their energy, while the sage archetype can help them develop introspection and wisdom in dealing with emotions. Jung also suggests that conscious emotional management is an important tool for an empath. This means being able to recognize when the emotions of others begin to affect us in a destructive way and taking action to maintain balance. This can include techniques like meditation, mindfulness, or even creative expressions of emotion, such as writing or painting. Working with emotions consciously and in a controlled manner allows us to regain control of our own energy and avoid burnout. Working with intentions and goals is also an important tool. Empaths who begin to feel exhausted should take time to reflect on what truly matters to them. Setting clear intentions that help them focus on their own needs is crucial to restoring balance. For empaths, this can mean making conscious decisions that protect their emotional space while also enabling them to continue connecting with others in an authentic and balanced way. Jung also recommends working with dreams as a way to heal. Dreams, an expression of our unconscious, can provide empaths with important clues about their inner emotional states. Many people don't realize how much information about themselves we can gain from analyzing our dreams, which often reflect our hidden fears, desires, and needs. For empaths who constantly react to the emotions of others, dream analysis can be a valuable tool in understanding why they feel depleted and how they can regain their emotional resources. Ultimately, the healing process for an empath is about restoring the balance between giving and receiving. Empaths who learn to recognize their own needs, establish healthy boundaries, and nurture their emotions can continue to be present and supportive in relationships, but not at the expense of their own balance. This process requires patience, reflection, and self-improvement, but with Jung's tools, empaths can regain their inner harmony and true capacity for authentic empathy. For an empath, emotional boundaries are one of the most difficult challenges in interpersonal relationships. On the one hand, empaths desire to connect with others, offering support and compassion, but on the other, they tend to absorb others' emotions, which can lead to exhaustion. Unhealthy boundaries, where an empath fails to distinguish their own emotions from those of others, lead to burnout, frustration, and a loss of identity. From a Jungian perspective, learning to establish and maintain healthy boundaries is crucial for maintaining emotional balance and restoring harmony in relationships. Emotional boundaries are internal rules that protect us from excessive emotional burden. These are the lines that mark where our responsibility for the emotions of others ends and our responsibility for ourselves begins. An empath who enters into relationships without clearly defined boundaries may begin to identify with the emotions of others, causing their energy to become diffuse and easily overwhelmed. From a Jungian perspective, this reflects a lack of integration of the shadow, the unconscious parts of our psyche responsible for our defense against external influences. Understanding emotional boundaries begins with awareness of one's own needs and boundaries. Self-awareness is the foundation upon which the ability to set boundaries is built. An empath must learn to distinguish their own emotions from those of others and understand which feelings are their own and which stem from external interactions. Jung, in his theory, emphasizes that to be fully oneself, one must begin to understand one's internal defense mechanisms and emotional reactions. This allows for the establishment of healthy boundaries that are neither too rigid nor too flexible, but rather strike a balance between openness and protection. Learning boundaries isn't just about learning to say no, but also recognizing when engaging in a relationship becomes harmful. It's also about maintaining space between yourself and others, which allows for emotional regeneration. An empath who doesn't set boundaries is like a sponge that absorbs everything, lacking the space to dry off excess sensations. In this context, boundaries aren't just physical barriers, they're also emotional spaces that protect us from becoming overburdened. In his psychology, Jung emphasizes the importance of psychological independence and emotional autonomy. This is the ability to be present and sensitive to the emotions of others without allowing these emotions to control our reactions and behaviors. From an empath's perspective, establishing boundaries also means understanding that helping others doesn't mean neglecting ourselves. Empaths must learn that helping others is important, but caring for their own emotional needs is equally crucial. At the same time, emotional boundaries must be flexible. This means that depending on the situation and the level of commitment in the relationship, an empath can adjust their boundaries. For example, during difficult times, such as emotional crises at home or at work, an empath may need to be more involved, but after this period ends, they must allow themselves time to recover. Healthy boundaries, therefore, mean a balance between giving and taking, between openness and self-protection. One of the key tools Jung suggests for setting boundaries is conscious introspection. Working on oneself through regular reflection and analysis of one's emotions allows an empath to understand when their boundaries have been violated and how they can reset them. Jung believed that introspection is key to understanding internal defense mechanisms and the mechanisms of emotional burden. Through this introspection, an empath can learn to consciously manage their emotions and energy, allowing them to better set boundaries in relationships. Emotional boundaries are not static but change depending on context, life stage, and relationships. Therefore, it's important for empaths to regularly assess whether their boundaries are still appropriate or require adjustment. Setting boundaries is a process that requires self-understanding, emotional maturity, and sensitivity to oneself and others. In his work, Jung emphasized that boundaries are not only protective but also a bridge to deeper relationships, because only when we have healthy boundaries can we truly connect with others without losing ourselves. Empathy, an invaluable gift, has its dark side when not properly managed. For many people with sensitive, empathetic natures, helping others becomes not only a daily practice but even a duty. Unfortunately, an excess of empathy, uncontrolled and without defined boundaries, can lead to emotional exhaustion and burnout, both in professional and personal lives. From a Jungian perspective, this burnout process is the result of an imbalance between giving and receiving, as well as a lack of integration of the inner energy that allows an empath to maintain balance in interpersonal relationships. At first, empathy seems to be a driving force in creating close and authentic relationships. An empathetic person can understand the pain of others, connect with their emotions, and offer support without expecting anything in return. However, when this process becomes one-sided and the empath doesn't receive the same support and understanding, problems begin to arise. Over time, this imbalance leads to emotional burnout. This manifests as a feeling of exhaustion, a lack of energy, and a loss of responsiveness to others' needs. In Carl Jung's psychology, the emotional burnout is closely linked to defense mechanisms that emerge in response to excessive emotional stress. One of the primary defense mechanisms contributing to burnout is projection, in which an empath begins to attribute their internal fears, frustrations, and unmet needs to others. Instead of confronting their own emotions, empaths transform them into external problems, leading to further preoccupation with the emotions of others rather than recognizing their own boundaries. Furthermore, burnout can result from a lack of boundary-setting skills. When an empath is unable to say no or limit their involvement, they fall victim to their own sensitivity. It's worth noting that empathy, while a natural mechanism for connecting with others, requires conscious management. If there's an imbalance between giving and receiving empathy, burnout begins, as the empath, unable to give themselves space to regenerate, becomes increasingly empty inside. In a Jungian context, individuation can be the answer to this trap. Jung suggested that a process of personal growth, which involves integrating all aspects of our psyche, including those that have been neglected or repressed, can help empaths regain balance. Individuation allows for the recognition and acceptance of one's own needs, emotions, and boundaries, as well as the development of inner autonomy. This is key to avoiding burnout. Empaths must learn to discern when and how to engage in relationships without losing themselves in the process. Empaths who struggle with emotional exhaustion often lose their ability to maintain meaningful relationships. Instead of building bonds based on mutual understanding and support, they begin to engage in superficial interactions that don't provide them with enough energy to fully participate in relationships. This behavior leads to emotional disintegration, in which the empath becomes increasingly isolated and indifferent to the needs of others. At this point, empaths must understand that they cannot help everyone, nor are they responsible for the emotions of others. To avoid burnout, empaths must strengthen their emotional awareness and practice self-care, consciously attending to their mental and physical health. Jung suggested that the healing process isn't about neglecting oneself in the name of helping others, but rather about balancing these two aspects of life. This means empaths must learn when to say no and when to set boundaries to avoid being consumed by others' emotions. The fundamental principle of avoiding burnout, therefore, is the ability to rest and regenerate. Empaths who are constantly emotionally engaged must learn that rest doesn't mean a lack of empathy. It's part of the process of nurturing their own emotional balance, which allows them to be present for others in the long term without losing themselves. Finally, one of the most important aspects of avoiding burnout is accepting one's limitations. Empaths who understand that they cannot be everything to everyone will begin to regain control over their emotions and their energy. In his psychology, Jung emphasized the importance of authenticity, or living one's truth. This authenticity, not trying to become someone one is not, allows empaths to avoid the trap of emotional burnout and remain whole and alive in their relationships with others. Empathy is a gift that connects people in the deepest way, but it also demands our special attention and care. For empaths, who naturally open their hearts to the emotions of others, it's crucial not to forget about ourselves. Otherwise, instead of giving, we begin to deplete ourselves, and our relationships become empty, drained of energy and authenticity. The process of maintaining healthy boundaries, recognizing our emotions, and engaging in relationships with the right balance is key to maintaining inner harmony and the ability to truly connect with others. From a Jungian perspective, the process of individuation is a response to the challenges empaths face. It is a path to self-understanding, integrating one's shadows, and learning to give of oneself to others in a balanced way without losing one's identity. To avoid burnout, an empath must recognize their boundaries, understand their emotional needs, and be able to distinguish their own feelings from those of others. Understanding yourself, working with defense mechanisms, and managing emotions and boundaries is not only a way to avoid burnout but also a path to true emotional strength and the ability to genuinely empathize. It's a balance between giving and caring for yourself, between openness to others and protecting your inner space. An empath who consciously manages their sensitivity can become even stronger and more present in relationships. And while the path to balance can be challenging, it is also the path to self-fulfillment and true connection with others. Ultimately, only when an empath learns to nurture their emotions and energy will they be able to give wholeheartedly to others without losing themselves in the process.